What's next? Yeah, just think about what the next thing is, and if there's a way that you can open up your mind to something new and exciting, then do that for sure. Yes. So I think just the question of what's next and who are the people in your life that can help you to get to the next bit. I think that's really key. I think community is really key. I think women and community is really key. Because there's a shared understanding. And I think just find your tribe, find the people that lift you up, that you can lift up, do the work on yourself, but try to make it not too heavy. Try to play with it and try to be kind to yourself as much as possible.
Welcome to the Boomer Woman's Podcast. I'm your host, Agnes Knowles. Boomer women. Are we wise women? Are we mavens? Are we crones? Hell yeah. And we're also still curious, fun-loving, interesting, the list goes on. This podcast is for you. My guests are folk who have a message for our demographic. And if you want to hear a specific message, let me know and I'll find the guests. This podcast is also a conversation. We women know its value, we know how to do it, and we must perpetuate the art form. I try and let my guests have the greater say, and usually we fit in a good laugh or two. Listen in now to today's guest. Welcome to the Boomer Woman's Podcast. I'm your host, Agnes Knowles. Today's guest seems to be a younger version of our boomer demographic. Thou shalt be married and be a great wife. Thou shalt have children and be a great mother. Amy was fortunate to have a career option, but that wasn't turning out as great as expected either. And then she rebuilt her life. Her bio reads, fast forward 5 years and I am now a happily divorced, imperfect mother, as well as being a life coach for kick-ass women. I am also head of HR at a financial education charity empowering young people. I am the founder of my own theater company. I'd say she's a kick-ass woman. I think she might have some great tips for us as we write the story of this chapter of our lives. Because here's another excerpt from her bio. Amy is a deliciously flawed, complex, and wonderful human being who supports other deliciously flawed, complex, and wonderful human beings to live their best lives. Amy Ewbank, welcome to the Deliciously Flawed, Complex, and Wonderful Boomer Woman's Podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. I've been looking at your website and I really like the angles you work from. So this is going to be interesting.
Me too.
Amy, you talk about story. You held a story in your head about having the perfect job, the perfect home, the perfect marriage, being the perfect mom. Was that story fed to you as a young person, or did you create that story for yourself?
Say a bit of both. I think there's societal stories that we are told about how we should operate in the world and what our purpose is, particularly as women. I've done a lot of work with women and I work exclusively coaching women. And you see the patterns come up again and again. I was brought up in quite a traditional household in the sense that it was a kind of nuclear family. My mum did bits and pieces, but was mainly a stay-at-home mum. And which is, I now know from being a mum, the toughest job in the world. So it's like at the time, you have that phrase, don't you? And that's another story as well, this idea of the stay-at-home mum. There's a damning nature to that kind of phrase. I know there's alternatives like homemaker and things like that, but there are certainly stories that I grew up with around what I expected that I would fall into, house of the country and all those sorts of things. And actually that isn't how my life has gone. But there's also obviously societal stories around what we think as women we are able to achieve and where we think we fit in the world and how we measure our success as well. I grew up in the 80s, so I watched lots of Disney films, and those are amazing films. Even now I rewatched The Little Mermaid for the first time the other day. that is really very questionable in many ways, that film. But at the time, it's an amazing story, you know. Ariel is very, very sexualized, and there's a lot of it that is, to adult eyes, looking at it as a kids' film, you think, my goodness, that's something else. But at the time, but of course, you're fed these stories around what women are and what women can be. And a lot of the time, that's being a foil to a man, that's being, you know, falling in love. Falling in love is the ultimate thing. And of course, it's very nice, but I wouldn't say it's the ultimate thing. So, yeah, it's a combination of both, I would say, to answer your question for sure.
Well, and just to go back to what you were saying about homemaker, etc., I remember that the comment of, "Oh, you don't work then."
Right.
And it's like,
oh my goodness.
"Excuse
Yeah.
me."
You work the hardest of everybody. It's like, I remember when I had my son, and all I wanted was to actually be back in a kind of office environment. You know, I was really kind of jealous of that, being able to go to work, because when he was very little, I was with him all the time. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, no one tells you it's quite like this. Like you think of this. Motherhood is a really good example of a story that we've been told. You know, we've been sold a story of what motherhood is like. And it really is, it was nothing like I thought it was going to be, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I think TV and media, even in my day, really supported that. Stay at home, beautiful. She wore dresses and high heels all day, and everybody was beautiful and lovely and perfect. And it's like,
yeah,
what?
For sure. I know. And of course, you're there with sick on your boob and, you know, all of the stuff that comes with being a stay-at-home mum. You're so tired, you know, all of that. And it's very challenging. And actually, yeah, it's the hardest job in the world. So there's definitely some reframing that needs to happen around that.
We've just taken a whole bunch of listeners down a really, I'd force amnesia that part.
Exactly. You don't need to go back there. Let's not think too deeply on it.
Now, our audience is mostly boomer women, and we grew up with lots of expectations that we've just been talking about. And we also had narrower storylines about the potential of girls and women. Where do you feel a woman's story primarily comes from? You've touched on home a little bit. And what is the connection between story and our life choices? Like, do we really follow it that closely?
Yeah, I think in terms of story and our life choices, I think one of the things that's so interesting in the work that I've done with women is that our brains are drawn to story. So we have a predisposition to think in story terms. And what that means is that sometimes there might be a situation where we want things to be neat and we want things to be tidy and we want them to have control over them. And, you know, this A happens, which leads to B, which leads to C. Only life isn't like that. So you can be searching for a story and a neat narrative, because actually all your brain is trying to do is look after you. So it's not a bad thing. But sometimes those stories really serve you. You know, you might think, right, I'm going to start this business, I'm going to do this thing. And you can think, right, this is where I started it. This is the middle bit. This is where there was a challenge. And then I got it and it worked. But most of us know that life isn't like that. It's really squiggly and you end up going in different routes and different directions. So, but our clever brains, which are amazing, are doing a lot of looking after us all the time, whether that's kind of us going into fight and flight mode or whether that's something like story as a structure to be drawn to. So I think there's that piece around, you know, the neurology and the way that the brain works, and it's sort of something I won't go into kind of in detail now. And also, I don't know a huge amount about it because I'm not a scientist, but from the very kind of top level reading that I've done, it's been very interesting to look into that. And remind me of your other question. I'm sorry.
And I think you touched on it earlier, but just, does our story primarily come from, I asked you where it came from, but I guess the options are like family, society, media.
Yeah. So media is a really interesting one. And I used to be an actor in a past life when I first so I came out of drama school, went to LAMDA, which is one of the big drama schools in the UK, graduated, ready to go, you know, wait for the agent to call. And, you know, most people that are jobbing actors know how that pans out, unless you're very lucky. So there's a lot of kind of waiting and wanting to kind of work in that way. But unfortunately, as I said, life doesn't go like that. But because of the fact that there was a story around what I thought my life would be like, and the media is a really good example in the sense that one of the reasons I actually left the acting profession is because I found that a lot of the stories that I was involved in telling as an actor were not very positive about women. So I was reinforcing stereotypes. And obviously, if you do certain plays from the canon, classic plays, they're not going to be particularly positive. But even with a lot of the new writing that I was working on, I was thinking, this is very interesting. Like, what's happening in these stories? So either I might have been in my underwear without any reason to have been in necessarily, or it might have been, sexual violence for the sake of sexual violence. And a lot of that happens on television shows. If you watch dramas, if you start to keep an eye out for it, then you think, was that gratuitous scene there that was actually quite violent towards a woman? Did that move the story on? Or was that for the sake of using, I think they call it fridging in comic book terms, where you use a woman's body as a device to move a story forward. Now, you could say that you would do that you could do that in lots of stories. You could say you do it of a man's body, but it's much more likely to be that women's bodies are kind of used as a kind of a vehicle and an obstacle, and things that aren't necessarily paramount to the narrative, but these things just happen repeatedly. And once you start seeing that in advertising or in television, and it's a much better than it used to be, but once you start seeing it, it's very hard to unsee it. So, when I'm on the tube now and I see in London, I go down the underground and see the posters and how the women are portrayed and how the men are portrayed. And it's, there are definitely narratives that we are constantly being subconsciously fed all around us. And I did hear someone say actually that trying to tackle some of these issues around gender and representation is like gardening in a gale, because it's impossible. There's only so much you can do, because it just keeps coming.
I'm stunned by what you said about using women's bodies to move the story along. This is a whole nother subject that we will not go into, but one question is that because many of the writers are men?
Yeah, many of the writers are men, but also a lot of women might write with those tropes just because it's what we learn. Unless you've kind of unseen it, unless you've kind of realized, because a lot of it's so subconscious. I might write something and then afterwards, I'm a white woman and I might write something that was offensive to someone that isn't a white woman, who might say, okay, did you not think about that? I didn't do it consciously, but I was ignorant of it. And that's not excusable, but it's sort of understandable if you're not doing it consciously. And so I think in the same way that is happening with representation of women more broadly across the board. But it really is just kind of an education piece to a certain extent. It was very interesting, we're slightly off topic, but when with my theatre company, we did a production called Might Never Happen, which was looking at street harassment against women and girls. And we took it to schools and colleges. But alongside the street harassment piece, we also looked at this idea of being a man and what that means. And we worked with a couple of PhD ladies who wrote these amazing pieces of work that it was based on, and worked with Durham University. And actually, one of the things that was so interesting to come out of it, which speaks to that point, is that actually a lot of the time they did in-depth interviews with men, and there was a lot of the time a discussion around using women's bodies as a way to bond with other men. So actually, if someone comes into a pub or a bar and says, check her out, it's not actually, and I'm saying that in the most polite way, but you imagine something very derogatory, which could be said. It's not even really about the woman. It's about the bond between the two men. It's actually one man saying to another, here's something we've got in common. This is on a very basic level, but it's actually, and that again, you could trace that back to, men's socialization. How easy is it for men to bond with each other? And is it easier to bond over a woman and objectify a woman than it is to talk about the deep feelings that you're actually feeling? So there's a whole heap of stuff, but it's all interlinked really with this.
Wow, that's a whole slippery slope. I'm going to get you back on. We can discuss all this.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Throw me a rope.
It's because I must admit it really gets my ire up. It's just, but yeah, okay. I'll stay on program here.
Good.
No. It's
once I get going on it.
You've just opened my eyes to a few other things too, though. That it's like, okay, I'm going to get back on that. Get back on that soapbox.
Yeah, quite.
Okay, you talk about ReStory. Can you explain that? I think that could well be of interest to women my age.
Yeah, so again, it's looking at the narrative that you have around your sense of self, really, and what you think are the markers of success and a successful life. And if we continually as human beings are saying, you know, once I get to this place, and I'm definitely guilty of this, like I am definitely guilty of this, probably on a daily basis. So that's why I can speak about it with expertise. Once I get to this place, I'm going to, everything's going to be great. And then I'll get to it. And then I go, oh, okay. It's not exactly how I thought, but there's another thing in the distance and I'll get there. And you know, this is a treadmill that I think a lot of us, a pattern that we're very familiar with. And if you have an idea about what the story of your life is going to be, and then you get there and it's not quite the same, that can really lead to the depths of despair, you know, in the worst cases. And actually fostering resilience and trying to understand that actually the story is malleable. You can find different ways ahead. And you can also look back and ReStory the way you look at things. So for example, when I've been coaching and I've worked with people, talked about their relationship with money, for example, and you think about money and you think about what is money and have you had it? And you'll often get a narrative that is kind of, it's always been this way, it's always been this way. And actually it's something that my coach did with me originally, which was to ask, I have then asked other people to do, it's just to say, can you think a little bit more about when it has been good? Do you know? So just trying to highlight areas of your life that you don't necessarily think of it positively because you've got a narrative around it. You know, you've always been unlucky in love. Have you always been unlucky in love? Is that 100% true? Or have you been sometimes unlucky in love and we've got this negativity bias in our brain, right? So we're drawn to that. And so it's about trying to, the phrase go with the flow is probably to underestimating it a little bit, but trying to step back from, our brains love narrative and they love story and they love drama. It would be no good to watch a drama of someone having a cup of tea because it's really boring, you know. It's just our everyday. If you made a film of my day to day, it would not get anybody paying money to go and see that in the cinema. But of course, we know what makes a good story, and so our brains are also like, oh, come on, let's go, drama, feed it. So it's trying to understand the patterns and then work back from there to see if you can, I say ReStory, but repattern your ways of thinking, which is not easy. And it's a lot of work, a lot of coaching or a lot of therapy or a lot of both in my case to try to do that work, but it definitely pays off.
So do we include in ReStory a whole new, perhaps, set of goals? So instead of being the perfect mom or the perfect wife, it's a matter of, you know, like I just want to know that, I don't know, something simple has happened at the end of the day before I fall into bed exhausted.
Yeah, it's about reshifting the focus, I think, rather than, you know, we live in a certain society, post-pandemic world is pretty full on. And actually, you know, in terms of the way people are living now, I think it's about trying to take the smaller wins, as you say. So like, what would be good at the end of the day? I'm not massively into journaling. I know some people are. I don't really tend to do that, but I know it works for a lot of people, doing a kind of gratitude journal and writing down what's been good about their day, but also trying to not be so hard on ourselves. You know, the way we talk to ourselves in our brain is, you wouldn't speak to a friend like that when you're in a negative mood, you know, and the brain is off. Just catching that and thinking, and not, again, you can get into a cycle, because then if you start berating that, then you know, but if you're able to catch it and say, okay, that's be a bit curious about it. That's very interesting that my brain has started calling me an idiot or slow, or just because I couldn't pay for the parking meter. Seems quite extreme. Do you know, like just trying to be a little bit curious about it and also have a sense of humor about it to a certain extent, and thinking of your brain as something you are not your brain. You know, your brain is doing the thing that brains do because it's a human brain, but actually thinking, oh, okay, you're having one of those kind of days today, are you, brain? Okay, let's see, I'll let you play out and I'll just get on with my day.
Do you mind me asking how you were able to restory your life?
Yeah, so in 2018, I was in the midst of having a 1-year-old. We've already talked about the challenges of motherhood, so we won't go back there too much. But I was really struggling and had a 1-year-old, and at the time things were not good with me and his dad. And we have since divorced, and we co-parent now. So for me, the idea of not having that at the time, the idea of divorcing and being a single mum, as I was, you know, for a bit, this idea of that was so awful to me because I probably had a lot of stigma around it, if I'm honest. I had some stuff around it myself because I thought it signified something. I now know, of course, it doesn't, but because I'm a human and my brain had caught that story. So actually, I had to do a lot of work around, well, what does this mean? I had to rebuild. And from that, was able to, for the first time in my life, actually, because I worked in creative industry, so I earned no money, and I'd always been supported by a partner. That had just always been the way it was for me. And then suddenly that was gone. And that was so good for me because at the time it did not feel good, but it meant I had to upskill quick. I had to upskill, I had to retrain, I had to do it in evenings and weekends, and then in COVID as well. And I had to go for another sort of career. And if that hadn't happened, then that wouldn't have emerged. So it's I watched an amazing TED talk. I can't remember the name of the lady now, but she says good or bad, hard to say. It's kind of, if anyone's interested, Google good or bad, hard to say TED talk. And she talks about it's really difficult in the moment you don't know whether something's good or bad. You didn't get a job. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's good or bad. It's just the lens you're looking through. So for me, things went that way. I essentially had a mental breakdown for sure. Like I was in a really bad place. I was processing a lot of stuff that was coming up for me at that time, and lots of family things as well. And actually having the support, having therapy, having support from friends, and realizing my resilience, I think, is a really big one. And then being able to support other people now and to be able to help them to realize their resilience and to change things and to think, why did I have that narrative? And what did I make that mean about me? Because a lot of the time you make things mean something about you based on your story. And it's trying to untangle some of that stuff, which is not easy. And it takes time and a lot of patience. But if you're able to support someone, as I'm able to do when I coach women, it's the most beautiful thing because you can see them start to really realize that their stories are getting in the way of the possibilities for them. And also not measuring success in the traditional way is another thing to start to think about. It's not necessarily that you earn 7 figures, that's not the only measure of success. Like, how do you feel after a day with your kid where you had a laugh together? Like, it's trying and see things a little bit looser, I suppose.
And I'm just going to add too that perhaps it's really important to remember, and maybe this is where journaling does come in handy, to remember what the success that you've had in recreating something, so that if something hard happens again, it's like, okay, I'm not happy about this, but I've done it before and I came out the other side.
Yeah, exactly. And whether that's journaling, whether it's voice noting yourself, whether it's talking to a coach about it, whether it's a community, whatever it might be, it's recording it, as you say, I think is really key to actually really say, okay, what happened what is this like that's happened before as well, trying to see how you've overcome stuff in the past.
Okay, so I was really interested in having you on podcast for a couple of reasons. And even apparently there's a few more now that we haven't gotten into. But the audience is mostly mid-aged women. Many of them are in a place where they can actually create their own next chapter, but they're not sure how to proceed. The option's never been available to them before. What do you say to them?
I would say look to the stories that light you up. So that might be other women or other men, other people that are inspiring to you. But also, I do a lot of work when I'm working with clients around the stories that they're drawn to. And if you're one of which I've got a workbook on my website, which people can download for free. And that talks you through a process actually of thinking of the stories that you loved growing up, for example. Like, what were those stories? The really exciting ones, the ones that made you light up, or even stories that you listen to now, whether it's a book that you've read, and thinking about what is it in those stories? What are the values in those stories that you're drawn to? Once you can drill down on the values, then you can find where it's likely that those pieces of you are really, really key in terms of your next moves, in terms of what you might do next. So I'll give you an example. When I first started doing some story work, I looked at the books there was a book that really lit me up. And the word that came out of it was looking around safety, around feeling safe. And actually, when if you start doing the work around what stories your creative mind loves, that will often lead to the practical answers that you need. So how are there other ways in my life that I can feel safe? Where are the areas of my life where I can work on that part of myself to give it more space and more time to breathe? Our creative brain is very different from, the chatter, the negative chatter. And once you are able to allow creativity, and once you're able to invite your brain to tell you the stories it loves, it will often have the answers for you. So it's really trying to be playful and then starting to think, okay, what is missing? And how can stories that I love help to inform that?
Well, that was food for thought, because as you were saying that, I was thinking back what stories, and all of the stories focused on a strong woman character lead. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, it's super interesting. And you start to think, well, what TV shows was I drawn to? Or, for me, I don't know if you know Roald Dahl, but I loved Matilda, the book from Roald Dahl. And that was all about this, well, she would be described as kind of precocious little girl. And I remember in those days, the idea of a little girl being a protagonist even was, you just rarely had them. It was very rare that a girl would be, and so I started to get in touch with, okay, what's that feeling when I think back at those stories? And it felt sort of dangerous when I think of the stories I liked that have female protagonists. And it felt exciting and it felt scary, because at that time there weren't women leading in those stories. It was very rare to find women doing cool things and leading a story. And so then you start to dig into, like, what are those things now? How do they play out in my life now? Am I still seeking things that are slightly scary and that are slightly exciting? And it's all of that work is very interesting, and you'll often see threads that will lead you to something once you start doing that work. What were yours? They were all women who were, was it
all
mainly women?
Like right back
All
from
women,
like
yeah.
early days of Nancy Drew. I mean, all
Right.
And I'm just thinking,
Yeah.
I'd get into series, all that sort of, yeah, it was always about that strong woman moving forward through the world.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Now look what you're
Exactly.
doing. Exactly.
Now, the other part of being this age is, we have daughters and granddaughters watching us. Like we've become that role model example. Is that a good thing, or is it sort of, just a scary thing?
I don't know. I think it kind of depends on how you approach it. I'm a big fan of stepping into the vulnerability space of saying, like, I don't really know what I'm doing if I don't know what I'm doing. And actually, I think there's so much power in younger generations hearing us say,
Yeah.
don't know. What do you think? And actually, and I think, again, it speaks to this idea that we need to know everything, we need to be everything, we need to have all the answers, be the best mum, best person in business, best partner, whatever it might be, that actually just to allow yourself to, and it's quite relaxing when you do allow yourself to be ignorant about things. And once you can model ignorance really truthfully and earnestly to younger generations, then I think that's really powerful, because I think it shows, it's quite hard, I think, because I think, again, culturally, it really depends on what era you grew up in. And I certainly notice a difference depending on the age of people and where they're coming from and their background and things like that. Especially if you didn't grow up, this generation now, I think, have grown up with mental health being a part of the narrative since forever. Whereas that was not a thing, when I was younger, and maybe when you were younger, the idea of someone being in therapy was like, well, they're mad. There was so much stigma to it. And so I think there will be equivalent things like that for young people now. And it's just trying to tap into those conversations that might be more difficult, that maybe we might find easier, but things that might be more difficult for them to talk about, and getting them to open up and just being vulnerable, and I guess sharing the stories that didn't always work out perfectly. I had a conversation with some younger people very recently. I was giving a talk, and it was really interesting because all of the stories that they had about their future, they were all very traditional and lovely, and nothing wrong with that at all. But it was interesting being a little bit older and thinking, you don't get too, I did sort of say, don't get too attached to a specific narrative. You can't really tell anyone because they don't really want to listen, but it's you can see it's kind of universal. I think we've been doing it forever.
You're giving me all these great food for thought bits, and I just realized too that there's a certain, I don't know if it's power, but just makes it easier to be a little fallible. So there's times when it's like, okay, this is what I want to do. And then you go like, okay, like sleep on it. And I have great respect for my children. So to say, okay, this is what's come up. I'm thinking this. What's your view on that? So just.
Yeah, for sure. Just backing it back and being open enough to say you don't know, or that you're wrong. That's really powerful, I think, of just saying, oh, I completely balls that up, I don't know what I'm talking about, is actually, there's a lot of strength in that, the sort of power of vulnerability stuff, all kind of Brené Brown type, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with. But that kind of approach, I think, goes such a long way towards making people feel safe, actually. We talked about safety earlier, to feel safe in their own, inverted commas, failures, which of course aren't failures, they're just life.
Okay, some mid-age women, they know they're stuck. They know they need to recreate that, but it's like they know they need to do something different. They don't understand about ReStory. Let's put it that way. Where do they start? I guess listening to this podcast.
Listen to this podcast. I would really advise, I think there's a lot to be said for things like coaching, things like therapy. Obviously I'm a coach, so I know about that stuff, but also I've been in therapy for years. I think starting with yourself and maybe returning to a version of yourself that you've lost. And I think creativity can really, really help with that. So thinking about any creative pursuits that you had when you were younger that lit you up, that fired a part of you, that were exciting, writing a story, and even, writing a story about your life, or imagining what your life could be like in 5 years, to think what could happen in the next 5 years, and make it extravagant, make it extraordinary. Just write crazy stuff down that you think that actually would be amazing. And then there's a lot of stuff around perfectionism and creation, right? So people worry that they've written a stupid story. Just burn it, do a little ritual, just burn it, throw it away, it doesn't matter, but just get some stuff out. And one of the exercises I do with people is, you might be familiar with morning pages. So when you wake up first thing in the morning, before you've done, there's lots of different ways to do morning pages, but before you've done anything, pen and paper by the side of your bed. Literally, as soon as you're conscious, you don't take a sip of water, nothing. Grab the pen and paper and write. And keep writing. It won't make sense probably because you're half awake, half asleep. If you run out of words, just write, I am writing, I am writing, I am writing. It's kind of automatic writing. So you don't have to think, oh, I've run out of words, I have to stop. If you run out of words, keep writing, I am writing. And set an alarm for, doesn't even have to be long, 15 minutes, 10 minutes to begin with, even 5 minutes to begin with. Just start writing some stuff out and see what your subconscious has got to say, because usually your brain knows a lot more on a subconscious level than it does on a conscious level. So it's trying to tap into that, whether it's through creativity, writing, artwork. Now I'm a big advocate of play in order to try to unlock. And I think especially when you do get locked, whatever stage of life you are, being able to play again and to have fun. Things are very heavy for a lot of people at the moment. And actually, how can you have fun? Go dancing, see a friend and do something you haven't done for a really long time, just to inject some vitality to help you to start to unstick yourself.
Two thoughts is, first of all, and I'll just, this last one is just, we can think about the last time we actually had a really fall down good belly laugh about something with somebody.
For sure. For sure.
Yeah, that's crazy. And now that I've put that in the air, I'm not going to remember the first one.
You're thinking about that belly laugh.
Exactly. The other thing you talked about, creating this news story that could be wild, it could be totally crazy, but we've talked about the power of the brain. As you write or read what you've written, is it possible that the brain's going to go like, I kind of like that idea, and it'll just stay there.
Yeah, and you may choose to begin with to not even reread it, because sometimes you write these things and you think, and the critical brain will come in and say that's a load of old rubbish. So, but equally, you'll know in your body when there's a kernel of something interesting. It could be a story about like a frog. It doesn't have to be about anything deep, but actually when there's something, there'll be something hidden in that story about the frog. Even if it's that you might read it to begin with and think, oh, that doesn't make any sense at all. But if you're writing something and if you're creating, there will be something in there, whether it is just more of a sense of play, or whether it's that actually the frog goes on an adventure, and what does the frog do in the adventure? It's a bit like dreams in that, often your people in dreams, the characters that you're dreaming about are you, right? So you'll often dream as another person, or you'll dream that something's happening to someone else, and then it's like, oh, okay, that's because that's happening in my life. So it's trying to let it come, and if there feels like something in your gut that thinks, that was a different morning pages today, maybe just put that one to one side and put the other ones, you can throw them in the bin, you can do whatever you want with them. Maybe if there's one that's like, oh, that was actually fun, is the key. I think it's really trying to tap into the fun and the joy, because there's nothing better than creating something for the joy of creating it. And that will lead to self-development. There's so much emphasis now on self-development. And I say this as a coach, so I'm fully aware that I'm in that sphere. But I think there's so much emphasis on self-development. You can end up going so far at your own bum, if you excuse my my phraseology, that actually it gets to be heavy. And there's something about creation that is lighter and that is not so navel gazing, really, that you just put it all out there, draw something, make something, craft something, and have a physical thing that you've made to help you process some of the big feelings and changes that you might be about to embark on.
Okay, I'm going to go slightly sideways here. We touched on it briefly, but I want to go one step deeper. I heard you speak about your son not wanting to watch a show with you because there were no boys. For generations, the girls who have been in stories and movies have been pretty generic. And I'm not going to get into skin color, cultural shortcomings. Here's a third podcast for us. But girls and women in media are usually slender. They're beautiful. they're able to run in high heels, or if they can't run in high heels, they'll depend on the hero to save them. We're just starting to see more female heroes, but it's pretty recent. How do we counteract what our girls see in movies and graphic novels?
That's a really great question. Being selective to a certain extent about what you're consuming in front of them, and what you're giving them to consume. So if it's a little one, then obviously thinking about looking up on websites kind of alternative narratives. Having said that, I did an awful lot of that, and I've basically raised a thug without meaning to. he's full on. I mean, that I've done so much work around. Come on, you have to understand it. It doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl. And he's blowing things up, throwing things. I would say, do you want to talk about your feelings? No. So there is also an element of nature nurture about this, right? But in terms of the stories, I think providing alternatives, even if they reject the alternatives, that they're there on the bookshelf, that it's actually like, do you know what? Yeah, fine. You don't pick up that book that I really want you to pick up and read, but it's there. And also talking about, my little one's 7, so I talk to him about sexism, which is in itself quite a funny conversation to have with a 7-year-old. For example, when I saw that what you're referring to, when we watched that video, he said it's sexist, which is really interesting because he knew it was about equality and about, I often say, it's about having equal numbers, but it's also about the things that they're doing. So I've tried to explain it to him, and of course he sees this majority, female, and he's just like, that is sexist. And I thought, right, the nuance. How do I explain that actually it's a countering a societal? I just thought, don't worry, just get a cup of tea. But yeah, I think it's having availability to those kinds of stories, and also making, if you feel confident to create something, even if they're small things, telling the stories, amplifying the voices of women that are doing different sorts of things, that have got different stories. There's amazing books now, but I saw at the weekend the new Spider-Man film, the Into the Spider-Verse, the second one, right? So Beyond the Spider-Verse. And the representation of women in that was amazing. It was so, it felt like there was no barrier, and the stereotypes just weren't there, and it was just brilliant. And I thought, gosh, this is very, very different. So things are definitely shifting and changing, and it's really just highlighting the questions around what are the women doing, I think is a really good one, because it might be there's equal numbers, but what are the women actually doing? And I don't know if you've heard of the Bechdel test. That's a test. So it was, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name right, but Alison Bechdel, who was a comic book writer. So she started this test, which is basically when you're watching a film, if there are 2 women in it that have a conversation about something other than a man, then it passes the Bechdel test, right? So you'd think that's easy. There are so many films that don't pass that test, and so many films that don't pass it now, as well, being made. None of the Lord of the Rings trilogies pass it. There's a bunch of Imitation Game. I talk about this in a little sort of podcast that I've got on my website, my mailing list. But there are a lot of stories that don't pass that, and that's a bit of a shock in 2023, where you think, gosh, okay, you would think that we got to a stage where actually women were leading a narrative, but it is certainly better, but it's having an awareness, I think, more than anything.
That's interesting too.
I'm trying to present alternatives.
Because I think for me, it was always more about the storyline, where the man was always the hero, and then just the visuals of this woman with an 18-inch waistline and 42-inch chest,
right. Yeah, and it's so interesting as well. And I think back to, I don't know if you ever saw the film Who Framed Roger Rabbit with it was the Danny DeVito film, but cartoons. It was one of the first films they had like cartoons mixing with humans. And there was Jessica Rabbit, who was a human, and she had massive boobs, tiny waist. She was cartoon, she was drawn. And I remember being younger, I was absolutely obsessed with her. I was really drawn to her. I thought she was amazing. And I remember my mum actually saying at the time, like, that's not good. And I remember thinking, I didn't know what she was talking. I had no idea what she was talking about. She has, this character is so sexualized. The slit goes up to her legs. And she's got anyone listening that's seen it will know she's, just Google Jessica Rabbit and you'll see what I mean. Massive lips, and it's all kind of pornographic, really. But it's very interesting that I'd never understood why I was so drawn to her, because I thought she was amazing. Now, of course, I can now see it's because she had power. She had a huge amount of power, but her power was through her sexuality. But at the time, you don't necessarily make the two. I just saw her as a female character with power. Now, the problem is when those two things are always interlinked, when we always see sexuality for women linked with power, then that kind of fuses that brain story. So then every time, then it's about trying to think, okay, what are the stories now where the woman is powerful and not conventionally sexy, sexualized in that way? But it's again, it's noticing these things, and even as an adult, kind of thinking to myself, gosh, I'll watch some things now and think, oh, I can feel I'm really drawn to that character. She's like femme fatale, a sexy woman or whatever. There's nothing wrong with that, but she's not bringing anything else to the table. But because she's got that, then I'm really drawn to it. And it's kind of thinking, okay, that's interesting. That's because of what we grew up with, the stories we grew up with.
So much to unpack.
I know. It's a whole other podcast.
Oh dear. Okay, it's today. You've talked about morning pages. Morning
pages.
Anything else that our listeners can do today to start thinking about their own life story, to move it forward, to ReStory?
So thinking about doing the morning pages, thinking about their current stories, about who they are, and even writing sentences of, I am a mother, or I am a wife, or I am a business owner, or whatever it might be, and writing them down. And then trying to think, okay, what am I missing? What have I missed here? Like, these are obviously key stories. These are key things that I see myself as. What else am I? Am I a friend? Am I a carer? Am I something else? Because often, even now, look at the list of the things I just listed. They're literally so sort of stereotypically female, right? I've gone friend, carer, mother, wife. Yeah, I said business owner, but that's in my brain, that wiring, and I've just gone straight there. So it's actually thinking, what else am I? Are there other things that I am, that I'm missing, that I can start to play with and to have fun with? So it may not be, that it's anything massive, but where is my strength? So I've recently, in the last few years, started weightlifting. And actually, like, that was something that had a real stigma around it, right? Women lifting weights, you're going to get too bulky. And this idea of too bulky is really interesting as well, because why don't we want to get bulky? That's, again, we won't go into all of that. But, things like that have been like, where can I be strong? And it doesn't have to be physically strong, but where is my strength that isn't necessarily the stereotypical things I think of myself, or the things that we think women should be? This idea that we are always kind, which I'm just like, I don't think that's helpful, because I'm definitely not always kind. Sometimes, I can be a real dick when I want to be. So it's actually just thinking, like, but how do I feel when I'm not? It's the people pleasing stuff, and trying to unpack that and think, well, what other things am I? Or what other things have I been in the past? Or what other things would I like to be? I'm writing them down as factual statements. I am this. I just am. And then as you start to repeat these statements to yourself, thinking, okay, how can I start embodying that in small ways in my life? How can I start to live those little tiny tweaks in my life where I can play with a different sense of self and a different sense of the story of who I am?
I've talked about our daughters and our granddaughters, but I'm so impressed with, like, you're just triggering all these thoughts in my head. But to take it the other way, to recognize what wasn't the traditional woman in perhaps our mothers. So for example, you may appreciate this during the Second World War, or when Second World War broke out, my mother was a wardress at Holloway Prison. So, that's
Right.
not a
Wow.
very girly job.
Yeah, that's
And to
yeah.
really go like, okay, like I wasn't really brought up totally
Yeah.
girly in traditional,
What must that have
different
been
at that point
like?
in time. She saw a documentary
Yeah.
about Holloway, I think during the 80s sometime, and she was horrified because in her day, like pre-World War II, often the women were sex trade workers who had such a hard
Yeah.
life that they would actually let themselves get caught so they could have a bunk, a shower, some food. So they'd stay in for a week and then be gone again. So a totally different
Yeah.
lifestyle, but still, during blackout, they had to unlock all the cells, that sort of thing. But,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, again, this is a slight tangent, but there are so many women that are in the prison systems that are either survivors or, running from domestic abuse situations. I mean, the statistics, I don't have them to hand, but they're shocking in terms of the women's experiences, women in prisons. But it's interesting to trace it back and to think where have different things come into play with your family lineage and what's been passed down to you and how you're passing other things down. It is definitely something to explore. And again, just explore lightly, stop playing with, because you can go down these rabbit holes, then it can get a bit heavy and
life
serious.
is all about rabbit holes. I say that to myself so many times a
Exactly.
day. Don't go down that rabbit hole. Okay. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you think mid-age women should think about?
What's next? That's it. Just what's next. Yeah, just think about what the next thing is, and if there's a way that you can open up your mind to something new and exciting, then do that for sure. Yes. So I think just the question of what's next and who are the people in your life that can help you to get to the next bit. I think that's really key. I think community is really key. I think women and community is really key. Because there's a shared understanding. And I think just find your tribe, find the people that lift you up, that you can lift up. Do the work on yourself, but try to make it not too heavy. Try to play with it and try to be kind to yourself as much as possible. We all have those days where we're down on ourselves, but actually that curiosity and understanding, is something that's definitely worth. When you notice something in your body as well that tells you something, it's about trying to get in touch with your body and thinking, that's an interesting reaction. One very quick story is that I recently found out I'm autistic. So I was recently diagnosed as autistic. And funnily enough, when I started listening to podcasts and things around autism, I got really angry, women talking about being autistic. And I can feel in my body, I was like, they're not autistic. Because it was sparked in something in me because they were describing my lived experience. And I didn't think I was neurodivergent. I had no clue. But obviously I noticed in myself, I thought, that's a really interesting reaction, Amy. Why are you annoyed? Like, what on earth has happened there? Because that's just someone talking about their experience. Then, of course, I dug into it and I realized that I got the diagnosis and all of that stuff. Because again, it manifests very, very differently in women than it does in men. It's one of those things that we think of it as the kind of Rain Man stereotype, and it's very much not that, particularly for women socialized as females. So I think it's just noticing those moments where you're like, oh, I'm very angry, or and anger's an interesting one for women as well, right? So allowing those moments, thinking, okay, something's obviously going on there. Maybe I'll make a note, maybe I'll come back to it. But just being curious around all those big feelings and not banning any that seem unsavory or uncouth or unladylike, I think.
And the one word that came to mind there as you were explaining your own neurodivergence is just the fact that it is a spectrum.
So, yeah, absolutely. And there'll be probably people listening to this podcast who may have had late diagnoses or may be suspecting that they are neurodivergent or and actually it's very interesting because in your generation that was never it was very rarely a thing. It was always kind of, if it was someone that was nonverbal or someone that was quite kind of extreme in the way that they outwardly showed it. So to start to think about those things, often they run in families and you think, okay, if people now who are younger are realizing that they are, I've had some really interesting conversations with my mum where I've said, I wonder if, it's very interesting as you start to, but that's breeding again a kindness to self to be like, okay, that's why sometimes some things might be difficult for me because my mind operates in this way. And it's the same as the story stuff. I've been fed a narrative or I've picked up a narrative. That's cool. Maybe it serves me, maybe it doesn't. Let's see.
Okay, so now I have to go that place that you've just really made me want to go. You coach. You're amazing. You're coach. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so I coach. So I coach women looking at their life story, looking at where they're at in their life. They might feel stuck. There's no criteria really, except that they want to make some changes. And I work with women to make tangible goals. So it's some of the talking around stuff, but a lot of it is like, what are we going to do? Because actually, therapy is much more kind of looking back, I suppose, broadly speaking, and coaching is present. Definitely some looking back, so you have to acknowledge the back in order to go forward, but also like, what's next? Like, what can we do? Like, what's the action plan for the next week until I see you again? What's the next thing that you're going to be doing that's going to light you up or that's going to get stuff done? Or, it doesn't always have to be exciting. It might literally be just, can't get to this thing. Okay, why not? What's blocking you? So I coach women and work with them one-to-one. I do a lot of work around creativity. And I love that work and I love seeing the change and I love seeing if someone starts, it's those aha moments that I live for where you see someone go, oh, right, okay, I'm onto it now. Once they're onto it, once they're onto their brain and the stories they've got, it's beautiful because they start to change and develop and grow. So yes, so I do that.
Now you mentioned your workbook. What is ReStory workbook?
So the workbook is on my website and you can download that. And that talks you through step by step one of the exercises that I mentioned earlier, which is looking at the stories that light you up. And it's in 2 parts if you sign up for it, just so it's a bit more easy for the brain to digest. They're both quite short. You'll be pleased to hear. But you can sit down with a cup of tea and work through it and actually start to think where it helps you bring out something called a story key, which is that word, is that thing that you have been drawn to in the stories that you've loved. And it's a good book, a good workbook, because you can do it again and again with different stories and it will come up with different things. So I definitely recommend people do that. It's completely free. And then at the end of I also have on an email that comes through a little webinar, which is like a 15-minute cup of tea break webinar, a little bit more about some of the stuff we've talked about today. So the Bechdel test and talking about women and story and things like imposter syndrome and boundaries. And so definitely sign up to my mailing list and you will get that through. And I'm also on Instagram if anyone's on Instagram.
Okay.
I'm not on any of the others. Yeah, Instagram's the only one I'm on. I can't do any more. Exhausting social media.
Oh dear. Okay, before we close, I read on your website, but with women holding only 30% of management roles in the UK, how do you empower junior staff members to be the change they cannot see? Should we be taking this opportunity, now I say we as in my generation of women, we take this opportunity to be the change that your generation of women should be seeing?
Yes, I think so. And I think you probably already are to a certain extent. I think it's allowing yourselves out to take up space. There are certain tropes around age and women in particular, and actually there are certain stereotypes that are playing out all the time. And actually to try to take up a bit of space by letting your stories be heard and your experience to reach younger people and to try to find commonality as well, because there will be a lot of differences, but there'll be so many commonalities that we lose because the media, again, feeds us this story that we're all so different because we Gen Z this, everyone's got kind of a label. And those labels can be really helpful, but they can also really serve to move us apart from each other. So I think as much as possible, telling those stories that are unconventional or that are, again, might seem a bit unsavory, or to try to say, there's lots of different parts of self. We're all multifaceted, and to allow that out and allow that change to be seen and demonstrate it as well. I love when you see someone in, in their sort of second or third careers, or fourth careers, or fifth. It's so inspiring to think, oh my gosh, you've done that. That's so cool. Like, we live a lot longer than we thought when we used to live, right? So it's like really filling that time and thinking, I've still got all my faculties. Why shouldn't I start weightlifting? Why shouldn't I start a class? Why shouldn't I start a business? I think there's something really inspiring about seeing that, especially as women. I'm now 40, and you start to come out of that younger bracket and you think, okay, well, who are my role models now? Like, where are they and what are they doing? There's definitely a lot of space for that, but it's about speaking up and it's taking space, and that's something as women we're not very familiar with doing a lot of the time. But just pouring yourself into it, even though it doesn't feel comfortable, I think is something to get used to, because it's very empowering for others and for yourself, I think.
And if you want to be empowered, please stay tuned to the Boomer Women's podcast.
Exactly. That's what we're doing right now. We're living
dear. Where do we find you on the World Wide Web?
So it's www.amyewbank.com. Very simple. My name is spelled Ewbank. And Instagram is Amy_Ewbank_. But hopefully you can put in the notes in case I'm not very good with when I'm listening. I can't always remember how people spell things out. So
no, that's great. Your website link is always in the show notes, and then you'll have a page at the website. You do have a page at the website, and all the links are in there. And I'll probably include a few other links that you've mentioned today. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, that'd be great.
Listeners, if you have thoughts on today's show, please talk to us. Leave comments where you're listening, or if you're listening at the Boomer Woman's podcast at boomwithabang.com, scroll to the bottom of the page and talk to us there. Leave stars and reviews where you can. They help us grow. Share this episode. Many of you are considering the next chapter, what it's going to look like. So are your friends. I can vouch for the fact that it's so empowering to know you're in the driver's seat of your own life. And if you're in the driver's seat, if you make a wrong turn, you stop the car, go somewhere else. It's a great feeling. And I would suggest downloading Amy's workbook. It might be a really good place to start. And don't forget a younger woman in your life may be watching. Amy Ewbank, thank you for being my guest today and giving us so much food for thought.
You're so welcome. It's been a blast. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to listeners for listening.
And have a great rest of week.
Thank you. Take care.